and you're in pain, soothing as a springtime rain, to have a friend right in your corner, your heart will feel a little warmer. Tender loving care, tender loving care, each warm and friendly touch lets someone know you care so much. Tender loving care, tender loving care.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Greenbrier Almond. Thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Each week on Channel 3, I'm happy to talk about this interface between Christianity and medicine. And I've been talking about the opioid use and misuse syndrome that we have in America that has become an epidemic. We don't use the term epidemic lightly. You can think of the plague, polio epidemic. Diabetes is spoken of as an epidemic in Appalachia. So it means many people involved with this illness, with this problem, and there are many roots to it. And I've been talking about this off and on throughout 2016. Began a program series just before this talking about the biblical overlay, having an unclean spirit. The man who was living in the cemetery of the Gadarenes, who had an unclean spirit that Jesus ordered out of him. These sometimes it would look like when I see someone in the ER or over the years have treated them at the VA or in our community who was dealing with an opioid addiction or other addiction problems, and then all the parameters of problems that go with that, life problems, that it would look like that they are under the influence of an unclean spirit. We speak of demon rum over the years. That's implying that alcohol and rum, in this case, is associated with demons. At least it's a very horrible thing when it takes hold of people. And so that we talked about the first segment the last time, but I want to continue today to talk about, and use an article from June of the 15th, 2016, American Family Physician, family doctors being the most common doctors in America, the most common specialty, the ones that prescribe most of the opioids, and a really good article that we'll talk about today about weighing the risk and the benefits of chronic opioid therapy. Apropos to this, again, from last week, I want to summarize briefly. Some 20 years ago, within my 43 years of practice, we began to speak of the fifth vital sign, and we wanted to address pain. We wanted to treat pain. We want to relieve suffering wherever we can as doctors. So as we began to do that, we turned to opioids, not realizing that we were creating an epidemic. Doctors have now been cautioned, and I'm sure all doctors are trying to adjust their practice and help their patient not get on opioid medicine unnecessarily, but not also suffer pain, maybe get alternative therapies of various kinds, physical therapy or other things that can help. But also, if they have a patient who's addicted now to opioids, then to begin to get off of it. So we're going to talk about some of the risks and the benefits of opioid therapy. Again, on the last program, I was trying to just work from a graph, a chart that lists a number of things about what doctors and patients talk about. I think it's a good beginning to a dialogue like this, an educational program on our Channel 3, our educational access channel here in Upshur County. Certainly, if anyone's on any medicine at all, and particularly opioids, they're a cardiovascular risk. And it's still the leading killer in our society. People begin to have their heart attacks, first of all, at age 48. Men usually are the ones having a spike there. The women and men catch up with each other, and by age 58, there's another big spike in death, cardiovascular events, and it continues, of course, into old age. So if you take a medicine like opioids, and many other medicines would qualify, there may be an irregular heart, there may be a heart blockage, some bad things can happen. There'll be sudden death, so any medicine prescribed correctly even can have severe consequences. Certainly the continued use of an opioid over time, there's an escalation in the dosage, or maybe the doctor and the patient are trying to relieve pain and they start with a low dose, and then that doesn't relieve the pain, they go to a higher dose and a higher dose. And by the time they get up to about 120 milligrams equivalent of morphine, 80 milligrams of OxyContin, you go to conversion charts like this and see, then you start to really get all the consequences, including cardiovascular death. Constipation and abdominal pain, another part of the syndrome of using an opioid. I remember when I was growing up, paregoric was something that my father prescribed as a country doctor, and I think at least once in my life I took some paregoric for some diarrhea, and it would stop diarrhea, but of course too much of it may cause constipation and abdominal pain, and anyone who's taking these opioids for pain knows how severe that constipation can become. A third part of the certainly talking points is that if a person gets on an opioid and they have not been depressed, they have to watch for depression. What we are having is a overdose death phenomenon in West Virginia. We are the leading state in the union for overdose death. And we're not even a very large state, are we? I mean, we're under 2 million people, and yet we lead the nation in overdose death in West Virginia. So, and some of these are accidental deaths, but some of these are suicides. And suicides are usually undercounted, and there's a preference to accidental death. But what got everyone's attention, particularly this year, maybe even why I'm talking about it, is that the overdose death rate exceeded then the car wreck death rate. So more people dying in West Virginia of overdose deaths than are dying in our mountain highway accidents, which are all too prevalent. And depression can be part of the syndrome of taking an opioid too long. So, of course, the hallmark of depression is a change in sleep pattern, a change in pleasure, and thoughts of suicide. And so people, if they are being treated for any chronic disease, we have to be aware that that's happening. The other thing that's happening, and this is almost spiritual to me because I grew up in an era where I don't think I had any of my friends commit suicide growing up, and now there's more and more young people committing suicide, but also we have suicide in the military. The Marine Corps came to the doctors. I was at a meeting in Atlanta this spring, and a general came to us and said, "I need help." I spoke to the psychiatrist in the audience. I need help because we have a suicide epidemic in the Marine Corps. And they analyzed it. It wasn't those in combat. It wasn't because they were in combat. Sometimes it's when they return home. Sometimes it's the communication they get, instead of a Dear John letter, as some of my friends got while they were in Vietnam, when a girlfriend said, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to wait for you. I'm going to marry someone else." Now they get this from a cell phone conversation in the middle of battle, someplace in Afghanistan or Iraq, and it overwhelms a Marine or any fighting soldier. And there are suicides for reasons like this. But then again, beyond that, there are a lot of unexplained suicides, so that it is alarming. So something in our society is allowing people what used to be a taboo to even discuss or think about or consider suicide, whereas at one time they would never have done that or seldom did that. All part of a depression syndrome. Save that for another day, though. because I want to talk about opioids. Another change that certainly needs discussed if anyone's going to be on an opioid is what we call hormonal dysregulation. As people get older, of course, one of the things that's going to happen, and 75% of the people, if they're old enough, will have a hip fracture sometime. And if they have that, then they will go to a nursing home, and then they may die in a nursing home. So it's not a good end, but that's a calcium imbalance, that's a metabolic condition, and other hormonal dysregulations can be worsened with opioids. We have, for example, people feeling tired and drug out, and we think of thyroid disorder, and we check on that, and that could be made worse with opioids. So a lot of hormonal dysregulation. If a doctor is going to prescribe an opioid, and you are a family member, you are the patient, make sure you understand what's your balance of hormones, and these are blood tests that can be done easily in the office. Finally, I mean, not finally, but ironically, in a sense that we take a pain medicine to relieve pain, but there can be opioid-induced hyperalgesia. So everything becomes more sensitive after a person's been on opioids for a while. It appears to happen at about 4 weeks out in most people. So if a doctor was prescribing an opioid for an acute injury, maybe for 2 weeks, maybe nothing's going to happen. But if they stayed on it for about 4 weeks, and there's a lot of increase in pain, it may be an adverse reaction to taking the opioid. Sometimes the saying is a dog chasing its tail. Sometimes the doctor and the patient will increase the medicine at that point, but the pain will not go away. And we have to think of this syndrome called opioid-induced hyperalgesia. The clue is that the pain is in a different part of the body than the original part of the syndrome. For example, if a person is taking an opioid for severe back pain or severe headache, and now suddenly they're developing great toe pain, I'm making that up, but something else, another part of the body, then that's a clue that it could be induced by the opioid hyperalgesia. That's the addiction part kicking in, and then the brain is asking for more of that drug, and it's sending signals of pain, not to that body organ, but just as recorded in the brain. There's opioid misuse and opioid use disorder, the addiction part. This is not something to be ashamed of. If a person is taking an addicting drug, they need to be told it's an addicting drug, because almost all of us, if we take a drug long enough of this category, we will get addiction. Just like if, when I was in college, we could, in experimental situations, get alcohol-addicted mice by feeding them alcohol every day, and they become addicted to alcohol in a laboratory setting just because they took it every day. So a person taking an addicting drug, whether it's alcohol, whether it's tobacco, whether it's an opioid, have a high risk of being addicted. It looks like it's at least 50% of the people who take it. We are still looking at genes that may cause addiction, and there are some people who are more prone to addiction than others, but anyone who takes an opioid for more than 4 weeks are at very high risk of getting addicted to that drug. And that simply means physiologically that when they're ready to come off the drug, they'll have to come down at a small pace every month, maybe 5%, maybe 10%. So see, it takes a year or two to get off of a pain medicine once they've been on it. Another thing that points toward addiction is that people who have been taking it for 4 weeks end up being on it for 4 years. So that's again a dog chasing its tail type of thing. We start to have a need for that drug. Overdose, I've touched on this, but I want to, as a talking point, I want to mention this again, and I'm covering things along the line of the American Academy of Family Doctors. so that I don't miss something, but these are things that come to mind and I mention them. But in overdose, the medicine can kill you by slowing down your breathing and your heart rate until you stop breathing, until your heart stops beating. And this is where naloxone, which is being actually will become available, if not in West Virginia right now, in the near future, and across America without prescription, and maybe without cost, because this is such an epidemic. And if a person stops breathing, their heart stops beating, maybe what will save their life is an injection of naloxone. And that may save their life for 15 more minutes, getting them closer to an ER where they can get more emergency care. So policemen, firemen, emergency folks, school teachers, a lot of people in authority, family members, especially if they're trained to give their injections, could use to their benefit sometime in their life naloxone. It may save someone's life. And the overdose epidemic also appears to happen in how we prescribe these medicines. Say someone has started taking a dose which is, let's just say, 10 milligrams or 20 milligrams of OxyContin. And then after a month or 2 or 3 months or 4 months, maybe this now 20 becomes 30, becomes 40, so forth. By the time it gets to be 80, people are in a high-risk area, but the medicine use does not even stop there. It continues. Now, there's a break in that. For example, someone's been arrested because of crime, and they've been off of it for a while, then they get released from jail. They start to take it again. If they started back at 80, that's going to be enough to kill them because their heart and their lungs are going to arrest because the tolerance that the drug built up is gone, maybe in that 10 days, 2 weeks, a month that they've been off the drug. Or other circumstances you can imagine would happen. Someone is prescribing, they go to a doctor, the doctor says, listen, you're addicted, I'm not going to prescribe, I'm going to refer. And so in the process of referral, the person's off medicines, they go to the street, they get the drug there, they don't get the same dosage, and they die. So all sorts of things you can think about where there'll be overdose deaths and why we have the epidemic. In physiological dependence and withdrawal, like many medicines out there, it's a two-edged sword. I suspect if we had our druthers, we should find another way to treat our pain. My daughter, who's now a doctor, recalls when I had a pelvic fracture. I was in a truck wreck, and I'm very fortunate that I did not die, but a truck landed on top of me, and I was nearly cut in half. I wondered if I would ever walk again. Of course, I prayed to God that I would, and I have, and that's been over 10 years ago. So I'm very happy to be alive. But as I was laying there, realizing that I didn't want to move because I had severe pain, a pelvic fracture is very, very painful, and my orthopedic doctor said, we can't operate, there's no bones to put back together again, we have to allow nature to heal you, but you're going to have to lay still for 6 weeks. Well, I had 6 weeks. As a busy doctor, I'm not used to laying around. My son, Ronce, got me a computer, handheld, and said, you know, Dad, you've been talking about writing some of Granddad's stories. My father wrote a very successful book, Stories of a West Virginia Doctor, and I knew more stories than he had written in his first book. And in fact, because of this TV program, I had 77 stories recorded. He had 52 programs where he was a guest on our program, Tender Loving Care, and he told a number of stories that didn't make it into his book. And so I could view the programs from tapes, and I wrote, and I am not moving, but typing things as I watched them on TV, reruns. I was able to write out 77 more stories and come out with another book. And that was fine. And I was happy to focus my mind. It took my mind off my pain. But my daughter then, observing me and our family and seeing what was happening, made a comment at the end of the ordeal, said, Dad, you know, your doctor had written you Percocet. He gave you a bottle of Percocet, and you could have taken those, and you didn't take one. And I wasn't out there to be a hero or anything or not take the medicine, but I knew that if I took a medicine, it would cloud my mind. I would be sleepy. I wouldn't be alert. I couldn't be creative. I mean, I knew these things about the medicine, and I had chosen not to take it, and to focus my mind instead on writing. So that's an alternative treatment, if you will, that I chose rather than take an opioid. Suppressed breathing. I want to talk about that for a bit. Breathing problems, of course, are severe. In West Virginia, we've been battling back and forth, about our coal-powered electrical generating plants, and many of these are being shut down now. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, other states suing West Virginia, the easily mined coal being harder to mine now, all sorts of things working against having coal-fired power plants will probably, in the end, clean up our air. I had a military pilot, tell me, as he would fly his own plane out of West Virginia into Ohio, he could cross the Ohio River. He could get about 10 miles into Ohio, and the air would clear up. And it's not that we're aware of it every day, that we live in a haze in the mountains here of West Virginia, but I've been aware of it as a child growing up here when we didn't have so many coal-fired power plants. And I would stand on a mountaintop and I could see ridge after ridge of hills. And then over the years, it was hazy to see. But all that will clear up. And all that to say that our respiratory diseases, asthma being the most common reason for a child to go to the emergency room, is likely to clear up because we will not have all the particles in the air. Now, just as the air clears up, if people take opioids, they will still have a respiratory depression. They could die of problems of suppressed breathing. And of course, the oxygen needs lungs. The lungs need oxygen. The brain needs oxygen. I watched the Olympics, as many of us did, and I watched these synchronized swimmers, and marvelous ballet underwater. 45 seconds underwater, kicking and swimming as hard as they can and staying in precision with all the other swimmers. Phenomenal amount of training to do that. But we can only go for a very short time without breathing. And so what happens with the opioid drugs, people stop breathing and it leads to death. Finally, to talk about with any patient or talk about with your doctor before you take a medicine like this is tolerance. Tolerance being the fact that you take the same dose over time, it doesn't do the same good, and you keep taking a higher dose and a higher dose. Maybe your doctor stops prescribing that dose and then you go to the street to buy it, and then sooner or later, having reached that higher tolerance, a person can die. So these are bad things that can happen to a patient. Let me talk about, switch gears a little bit, but try to outline for you how doctors are being asked to deal with this epidemic of opioid use and misuse and the death rate, which is phenomenal because more people are dying of opioid deaths than are dying in car wrecks. Well, one of the things that are out there, and you may not have known that if you went to get a prescription filled, that the information that the pharmacist uses as he fills the prescription will, by law, be required to be entered into computer banks in each state. There are now 48 states that participate in this drug, how is it called? Pharmacy data management system, electronic database. And so as a doctor, if I have a patient, and I'm clearly I have an interest to know this because I'm the doctor, I can get my control number, I can enter the database, I I can access information, confidential information, and I can find out if a patient is taking prescriptions from, say, several ER visits, different ERs on different days, and they got 30 each time or 100 each time of whatever pill they're being prescribed, or if they've got shopped from doctor to doctor and those doctors' prescriptions have been filled, then that information will be available in a logged system. And that's very helpful because if we're going to combat an epidemic, we have to then, doctors and patients have to work together to make sure we first do no harm. Some of the early signs of an opioid crisis would be early refills. So if a patient's always running out of refills, taking too many, then that's a sign of use or misuse. If there's the same or similar prescriptions from multiple physicians, doctor shopping, then that's a red flag, a warning that something's happening. Now, a lot of doctors are in group practice, so if I were a part of the VA system, which I was for 17 years, then I was in a building with multiple providers, the primary care, the psychiatrist, the anesthesiologist, surgeon. Different people could be prescribing medicines. Now, we all went through a common pharmacy in that case, and that information was known to us, but that would not be doctor shopping, but this would be where a person's going from town to town or from podunk place to get prescriptions, spending increasing more time getting their prescriptions because they're taking too much of it. That's doctor shopping. Of course, there's dangerous drug-drug interactions, and that a patient may or may not disclose that to a doctor that they're taking a benzodiazepine like Valium and a codeine like an opioid. And if they are, then that's a risk for their heart, a risk for their lungs, and it's a higher risk than for death or bad events happening. And of course, I mentioned earlier, but if the dose of morphine exceeds 120 milligrams a day, then they are in the highest risk category of dying of their syndrome. So we want to treat, but we don't want to treat with too much medicine. Of course, there could be false signs. I mentioned that people have been, doctors put them on 2-week prescriptions, but they get more refills. Well, the doctor's trying to taper the medicine, and that's not a problem. Or if they have gone to a group practice and different members of the same practice have written, that's not a problem. Let me share one other area here in closing today, because you may or may not think about this. Opioids come in different categories. Methadone, as it turns out, we have methadone clinics throughout West Virginia, and methadone is one of those drugs that can kill people. They stop breathing, their heart is more irregular on methadone than almost any of the other opioids. Yet, state law has not allowed, federal law has not allowed doctors in the practice to know about methadone. A person go to a methadone clinic, that's a federal clinic, the information does not come back to the local family doctor. That's a problem when we have an epidemic like this. Hopefully that will be corrected. But methadone, if a person is on an opioid, perhaps methadone is not the one to be on if there's a risk for sudden death. And that's something that we don't think about. The other thing about it, the opioid poppy, this is my own personal interest in this, that Afghanistan supplies a good part of the world's opium. And here we have been fighting there, and I don't understand this from the range of facts, but my son, who does international aviation law, has told me that the United States has built a number of very nice airports in Afghanistan. They do not have a train system, and they don't have a road system in Afghanistan, but they have airports. Well, as we pull out of Afghanistan, these airports are available to people who want to buy opium, fly them back to America, and sell them to us on the street, and lead to this epidemic. We have not done a very good job of thinking this through. on a worldwide stage. I'm sure there's a lot of money to be made, and there's reasons why this has not been solved. But right now, I look at it as a person living in West Virginia, a citizen of West Virginia, and wondering what's happened to my own neighbor and my own friend. And I think that there's many things we can do to deal with this. Well, perhaps this is enough to say today, but I hope that you will join. I'm going to continue to talk about the opioid crisis from time to time on our program, Tender Loving Care. Special thanks to Channel 3 for this opportunity to come your way each week, and for 38 years been talking about this issue that's at the interface between Christianity and medicine. And certainly we want to love our neighbor, we want to have everyone as healthy as we can, and really at the bottom of all of this opioid crisis, there is a spiritual issue that we have to deal with. Until the next time, hope that you think about this and join me in the future. Thank you.
Stories of a West Virginia Doctor, written by Dr. Harold D. Allman. A collection of 55 short stories about his experience as a small-town doctor in central West Virginia. And Tender Loving Care, Stories from a West Virginia Doctor, Volume 2, written by Dr. Greenbrier Allman, using videotapes to write 70 additional stories of his father's very colorful life as a small-town doctor. They can be found for purchase at Amazon.com and most local bookstores. Tune into Channel 3 Buckhannon for Tender Loving Care with Dr. Greenbrier Allman, where he talks about the connection between Christianity and medicine.